Good morning, APUSH students. Mr. Connor here on a Tuesday, March 31st, last day of March. Who would have thought March ends like this? Yikes. Anywho, this is the second video I'm making about period 2, the colonial period, and we're going to do the late 1600s. A bit of an arbitrary cutoff. There's no magical thing that makes 1700 different from 1699. I just wanted to divide it into some 50-year periods so you can get a sense of the chronology. Anyway, just before we get going, today's hat is my 2007 Red Sox hat. They are one of my all-time, maybe my favorite Red Sox team of all time. Just a machine of a team from the start of the year to the finish. Man, if you have any time, bring up some videos on them. Just a great team. All right, so let's go. What's in this review? We're going to look at turning points in 3 colonial regions. That used to be an AP skill. You'd get an essay on turning points. And even though it's not there, I think it's a great way to measure like cause and effect. A cause leads to a turning point. A turning point has many effects. Then some changes as a result of these turning points. Throw in some things about some new and other colonies. And I want to end with a continuity thought, because even though we're looking at 100 years here, 1600 to 1700, between this video and the last one, there's a major thing that's the same I want to point out. All right, let's get going. So here's the 3 turning points. They all involve Native Americans, interaction with Native Americans, and they all have pretty major effect. In the Chesapeake, there's Bacon's Rebellion. In New England, there's King Philip's War, and New Spain, there's Pope's Revolt. And they're all within this 5-year period, 1675, 1680, which is nice that we can all kind of remember. All right, around 1675, there's some major changes. It's a good way to kind of like mark the century off before and after. That's what a turning point is. Anyway, so the first one, Bacon's Rebellion in the Chesapeake. The context there, because contextualization, folks, big deal. People are living longer. It's not the massive death rate of 80% of the early years of the Chesapeake. On the other hand, the price of tobacco has gone down. It's not this rare item. It's planted in a lot of places, so you don't get as much for it, which means you need more land to recoup. You need to plant more to be able to sell more at the lower price. So one result of people living longer too is servants are living out to the end of their indenture. So they make it to the 5-7 years, they don't die. And the deal with an indenture is you get land at the end of it. So the people giving out the indentures have to give this land now, and that actually helps the price go down even more because now more land is being cultivated. And it also creates a situation where there's all these former indentured servants. Of course, they want land, and they feel they're owed land if they live out their indenture. And the best lands have been taken on the coast, so they are asking the government in Jamestown to push west more, to fight more Indians, to take more Indian lands, and the government is actually not really interested in doing that so much. This is where we get Bacon's Rebellion from. It's a rebellion of these largely former indentured servants who are angry the government is not responding to their needs. They actually form this group. They attack and burn down the capital of Jamestown. Nathaniel Bacon, their leader, issues a statement sort of basically threatening class warfare will come after the rich people. He ends up dying of disease. Interesting, given that people live longer, but not Nathaniel Bacon. So it does fail, but it points to that this is going to be an untenable situation. How is this going to be resolved? The answer we're going to see, unfortunately, is a bigger turn towards African slavery. But this does mark, I think, a transition point in the Chesapeake. All right, King Philip's War, also around the same time. Similar land issues where more generations of New Englanders who have always lived longer and they have large families, they want to spread out. They encroach on lands of Native Americans. That's a tension. There's these efforts to assimilate Native Americans. Some are living in these praying towns, these areas where you don't live with the English, but you don't live with your own people. You're living in this place to learn English culture. And there's tensions between those people and the people living with their tribes. There's tension with them, the English, and actually a praying Indian gets murdered, and that sets off this revolt coordinated by Metacom, who is called King Philip by the English. And it's a massive, last several years, goes throughout Massachusetts. I mean, it's where I am, southeastern Mass. It's down here. It's out in western Mass, in Springfield. It's in New Hampshire. A third of the towns of New England getting destroyed in this war. It's like a world war of its time, if your world is New England, I guess. And the English eventually win, and it is the last sustained resistance by Native Americans. That doesn't mean there isn't a feeling of threat there, but this will be the last time there's a great rise up. So it's turning point in those relations there. And then out in New Spain, don't forget the Spanish are still there. They don't stop being there just because we're looking more at New England. Their control was always weakest out in Mexico on the borders, on the frontier fringes of the Spanish Empire. And so these efforts of Spanish friars to assimilate Native Americans and not let them, they want them to be Catholic, so you can't conduct your own religious ceremonies. That causes attention. There's also some bad harvests going on. And a group led by this Indian shaman named Pope ends up conducting a revolt, and in the short term, they're actually success. They overthrow and rule themselves for a few years. The Spanish do make an effort. They come back. But there is, after that, some cultural compromise. They're not as strict in their adherence to assimilation. They're sort of, they still baptize them, want to be Catholics, but they're sort of willing to look the other way with other cultural practices being conducted. So that, I think, is an interesting turning point. I don't want to make it more than it is, like, and everything was fine between them from then on out. Still rough, brutal stuff, but it's interesting development in that they're all happening, all these three things around the same time. So the biggest change, I think, is got to be this one. This is the thing in American history, the transition to African slavery. It has so many effects that we are still dealing with today. So, as mentioned earlier, there are these people are living longer. Servant prices, however, are the same, so it costs the same amount to import a servant as it did in the era where tobacco price was better. So it's more costly than ever to import a servant, in a way. And they're living longer, and they're getting these obligations that need to be met when the indenture is up. And I want to contextualize this because this has come up. I see it on tests sometimes, so don't write this on the AP exam. But when white people turns more towards buying African slaves, it's not because buying a person is cheaper. It's never cheaper to buy a slave than to have an indentured servant. It's always more expensive by a lot. So that would be a very deceptive thing. Say, people turned to slavery because it was cheaper. No. It actually, just in cold economics, is considered more viable because if people are living longer, then buying a person means they're going to live longer and serve you longer. And if you can get their children and call them slaves as well, which we're going to see is what happens, that furthers your slavery. As opposed to a servant who lives out there 5 years and then it's gone, and then you need to get a new one. So, it's not that slaves are cheaper. And obviously not everyone has one because they are more expensive. But it is a transition that starts by this period. I want to say there's a handful of enslaved people in, say, 1650, like less than 100, and there's like a few thousand by 1700. So big difference happening here. Bacon's Rebellion is a factor. This idea that these unruly lower class former servants, agitating to get more Indian lands, how do you deal with them? Well, if you enslave people, you don't free them, give them land, and they won't agitate, or at least they won't have the right to agitate. So it does take care of that. There's also the servant population is drying up. There's now more places we're going to see people can go. So in 1610, your option is the Chesapeake. In 1620, it's still the Chesapeake because the Pilgrims are not welcoming you in New England. They're not inviting servants, really. but now there's Pennsylvania, there's New Jersey, there's southern colonies, New York. There's just other places you can go. So that also has a factor in the transition towards African slavery. And by 1700, there have been some, or 1705, but we can round off. There are these slave laws in Virginia that define slavery by race. A slave is a person, a non-Christian, with dark skin. That's how they're defining them. Slavery is defined through your mother, which is very self-serving because English culture, everything was defined through your father, who your father was, the son through the father. They're defining who is a slave through the mother. So this is what makes this different. And this is why it's such a big deal. You're creating a racial-based slavery system. There is slavery in the rest of the world. It's not all race-based. So this is not uniquely American, but this is the big feature of American slavery, is defining it by race. And what we get, what historian Edmund Morgan called the American paradox, that freedom is created for white people because of the slavery of black people, that those people who might have been the lowest class are now bumped up a class. Their taxes could be lowered. They can be given some rights. And they are, this feeling of racism we're going to see is created during the 18th century. Is there's this sense that even the poorest white is still above African or African American enslaved person. So that is a huge legacy. In New England, this doesn't seem as dramatic now, but to the time, the Puritans, their experiment in their city on a hill is not going well in the sense that they feel they are not as religious as they should be. They actually lower the requirements for church membership in what's called halfway covenant in 1661. So that's a cultural point. The Salem witch trials, of course, seem to be an example of Puritanism just exerting its conformity, but the backlash against the witch trials, where they end when the governor's wife is accused of witchcraft, there's an apology, 10 years too late, and of course people are dead, but the religious hysteria is never gets to this level. No one's ever accused of being a witch again. There's no massive witch trials. I mean, New England is still plenty religious. We wouldn't say in 1702, like, oh my gosh, these people are secular. No, but this aspect changes a lot. Economically, by the end of the century, New England has turned towards fishing and shipbuilding. All these forests are combed for their lumber, which are used to build ships, which we're going to see in the next video, are transporting a lot of the goods of the Atlantic trade, including the slave trade. And fishing has a slavery connection that we're going to see they're supplying food to the West Indies. So that's an economic change. You don't see that in 1620, but you see it by 1700. And then other colonies, just to wrap up here. As I mentioned, Pennsylvania is now a thing. And it's a much more tolerant place than, say, going to colonial Chesapeake. Attracts more people. The West Indies, on the other hand, are basically in the most exploitative society in British colonial America. Once they start growing sugar, eventually the black slaves outnumber the white landowners and tenants. And the death rate is so high because people are just worked to death that they constantly just import people for sugar. The population never raises on its own. It only is kept steady or growing through the slave trade. So very, very brutal society. And the Carolinas, North and South Carolina, are actually set up by people from the West Indies who want to duplicate that society. They don't grow sugar, they have rice and indigo, but they are very strict racial-based societies. So there's a real mix of other colonies going here. And New France is there in what we call Canada. They never get the population that New England or Virginia does. They rely more on their alliances with Native Americans because they just can't get people to come over. So they're not nicer to Native Americans because they want to be. They are just sort of forced into a more mutual relationship. Anyway, I'm running out of time, so my last point is they're still Euro-centered here. Everything, colonists do not hang out with each other. The Navigation Acts make sure all goods are imported straight to Europe. And I'll get more to mercantilism in the next video. All right, stay tuned for that. Hope you're doing well. Stay safe.